Hello, my name is Amy and today I am super excited to be talking to you about one of the most well-known styles of wine in the world. The Italians had to change the name of their grape just to preserve the integrity of their produce. The Germans are thought to have the highest consumption per capita of this style of wine. The French are known to produce some of the most expensive bottles, quoted to taste like stars, and the English are now making bottles that can rival the French in wine competitions. I am, of course, talking about sparkling wines, and today we are going to look at a variety of sparkling wines from across the world and what their differences are. Now, it seems only right to start with perhaps the most famous version of all of these, which is champagne. But isn't it all champagne, I can hear some of you ask? No. There is a great confusion in many wine-producing countries and many non-wine-producing countries that when you see a glass of sparkling wine, it has to be champagne. But in fact, le champagne, the drink, can only be called le champagne if it comes from la Champagne, the region. If it doesn't come from inside this very northerly region in France that's cool, that's got fabulous soils for producing Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier, which are the grapes that are used typically in Champagne, it cannot be called champagne. It will be called one of the other versions of this drink. That's point number one. So point number one is provenance. Where does it come from and what is it allowed to be called? Point number two is its method of production. Now, within Champagne, for example, they use what they call the traditional method or méthode traditionnelle. This method can also be used in other parts of the world. If they're not using this method, they will be using what we call the tank or the charmat method that is used in things like Prosecco or other sparkling wines. The most important differentiator between the methods of the production is where the second fermentation takes place. And in the traditional method, it takes place inside the bottle. So the base wine, which is an incredibly acidic wine, is typically made, fermented separately, the white wine and the red wine. Remember, it can be Chardonnay, Pinot Meunier and Pinot Noir grapes, depending on the style of champagne that's being made. They add what they call the liqueur de tirage. This is a blend of yeast, sugar and young wine that gets added to the bottle. The bottle is then sealed, and what this liqueur does is provoke the second fermentation inside the bottle. The bottles start at an upright position and then they undergo what we call the process of riddling. Now, a riddler back in the day could turn about 50,000 bottles a day, so it's no mean feat, this job. And the idea is to turn little by little every single day the bottle of champagne, so it starts in an upright position and it ends in a slightly inverted position. And what that does is it ensures that the dead yeast cells that have been left there from the second fermentation and from adding this liqueur end up in the neck of the bottle. When the bottle is slightly inverted, the neck gets frozen. The yeast cells are frozen in the neck, they pop out, and then a second liqueur is added, which is called the liqueur d'expédition. And this is a blend of cane sugar and wine. This whole process of removing the dead yeast cells, which are now in an ice block, we can call it, in the top and the neck of the bottle, is called disgorgement. And the following liqueur to be added, which is the liqueur d'expédition, which is a blend of cane sugar and wine, is what we call the dosage, and the amount of sugar in this liqueur essentially determines the style of the champagne and the amount of sugar it will have. So other things to bear in mind about champagne. So I mentioned for non-vintage champagne, which is what we've just been talking about, the wines used can come from several different vintages. In fact, up to 14 different vintages. Sometimes they use the base wine from those, particularly if a house champagne is being created. They always maintain a store of base wines so that they can be consistent in their style of non-vintage house champagnes going forward. A vintage champagne, when we're talking about vintage, we're not talking about how old the champagne is, but we're talking about the specific year in which it's been produced. And on that year, only wines or grapes from that year will be used in that champagne. And these tend to be far more special. They're much more expressive champagnes, and people pay a fine whack for them as well. Other things you may find on a champagne label are luxe cuvée or cuvée prestige, and these are the most coveted bottles because they use the tête de cuvée, or the head of the blend, which is the first pressing of grapes, and these grapes tend to be far less tannic. They have much more finesse to them. Things like Louis Roederer's Cristal or Moet Chandon's Dom Perignon are just a couple of examples of what the tête de cuvée, the luxe cuvée, the cuvée prestige would be. One final quite curious thing about champagne is that not many champagne houses own their own vineyards. In fact, they rely on growers, or négociants they call them, and buy the grapes from them. So it's important when you look at a champagne label that it says RM, which is récoltant manipulant, which are champagne houses that grow their own grapes and use their own grapes for their champagnes, or NM, which is négociant manipulant, which is where they buy grapes from local négociants or local grape growers. Now, I mentioned there are 3 different grapes that can be used in the production of champagne. They don't all have to be used in every champagne, and that's why we can find Blanc de Blanc champagne, which would be strictly Chardonnay. Chardonnay is there to add sort of elegance and finesse to the champagne. Pinot Noir, which tends to add more body, slightly earthiness to the champagne as well. And then Pinot Meunier, which adds a bit of youthfulness, a bit of sort of vibrant acidity as well. I personally love a Blanc de Blanc champagne. I also love a vintage champagne. I think the more contact that the yeast has with the champagne, the more sort of toasty it gets, and that's a flavour that I really, really appreciate. Now, if you like the taste of champagne, but perhaps you don't have the budget, because they can be astronomical, some of them, not all of them, and in fact there are loads of good bargains, especially around typical dates like Christmas or Easter, where champagne is usually on special offer. But if you still want something slightly more economical, you could look for something called a cremonte. Cremonte is a sparkling wine, still from France, made in the traditional method, so it undergoes the same process as champagne, but it tends to use grapes from the region in which it's made, and it tends to be far less expensive, but still very, very nice. So Crémant de Bourgogne, for example, Burgundy being in the same area as Champagne, you'll get something that's probably quite close to a Champagne. In fact, there are a lot of Champagne houses that like to produce a Crémant just to offer a more economical version of their top wines. Crémant d'Alsace, which would probably use Pinot Gris, tends to be a lot more acidic. I love that one. So these are more economical versions. They'll give slightly different tastes, but really, really interesting to try. Now, moving further down the Mediterranean, we come to Spain, where Carver, their national sparkling wine, is to Spain probably what Champagne and Crémant are to France. A sparkling wine made in the same traditional method as Champagne and Crémant, but using different grapes, slightly different grapes, and also slightly different aging as well. The somewhat strange thing about Carver as well is that although the majority of it is produced in the north of Spain, in the Catalan vineyards of Penedès, It can also be produced in other parts of the country as well, so it's not limited like Champagne is to one area. You can find carver from Rioja, Navarra, Valencia as well. Typically the grapes are native Spanish grapes, so for the white version of a carver they would use Charello and Perellada, and for the rosé carver they would use Monastrell and Garnacha. More recently, they have actually permitted the French grapes of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay to also be used in carver, but it has produced some controversy from growers who said it somewhat takes away the point of difference of carver if they're being allowed to use the same grapes as they use in sparkling wines from France and within the Champagne region as well. Now, as I mentioned before, one huge impact that Spain had on the carver industry and latterly on the champagne industry, who borrowed their methods, is when it comes to the process of riddling. So the French riddlers were doing it by hand for decades, centuries, and the Spanish invented what they call the gyro pallet, which is a mechanized way of doing this, which saves a lot of wrist ache, and that is a huge contribution to the sparkling industry as a whole. So, things to look out for on the label of a bottle of carver. First, you want to know where it's come from, and new regulations actually just introduced in 2020 will make it far more obvious the area of provenance of the grapes and where the wine has been made, so that you can tell if you're drinking a carver from Valencia or in fact from up in Penedès, which I think is really interesting in terms of the expressions and also the differentiations between the different styles. In terms of aging, carver tends to be classified according to the following. It has a minimum of 9 months where it has to be left on the lees, and this is called this very entry-level carver is called carver de guarda, and then the following aging rules apply. So 18 months aging is carver de guarda superior. 30 months aging is a reserva carver, so reserva carver. And 36 months aging is a gran reserva or great reserva. What this aging does is just change the style of the carver, but the interesting thing is where you leave a champagne to sort of have more autolytic, they call it, yeasty elements, and it produces sort of toast and bread and brioche. In carver, the taste tends to turn towards something that's a lot more smoky and a lot more rubbery in texture and taste. So if that's something you like, then fabulous. Most carver is medium-bodied, medium-priced, not particularly meant for aging either. And similar to champagne, it also now classifies its sugar levels on the label. Particularly with all this awareness of sugar intake, styles like Brut Zero or Zero Dosage or Ultra Brut are becoming really, really popular because you're drinking the least amount of added sugar possible. Now we continue even further down the Mediterranean to Italy. And Italy is sometimes somewhat synonymous with the production of Prosecco. And here's where we really delve into a slightly different method of production. So we're leaving the traditional method with the fermentation inside the bottle alone and moving on to what we call the tank method. And this is a slightly cheaper way of producing a sparkling wine, usually used for bulk production, but that doesn't mean you can't find some really, really good examples of good quality Prosecco. Essentially, the base wine is placed in huge sealed, pressurized containers that are then pumped with carbon dioxide. The wine is then filtered under pressure and put straight into the bottle. But Prosecco also has more of a natural sweetness to it, and I think that's why there was such a huge boom, aside from the price being incredibly accessible. But there was a huge boom because the drink itself was far more accessible. And on that, it actually led to Italy changing the name of the grape that they used to produce Prosecco. So Prosecco used to be produced by the grape of the same name, Prosecco. But when they realised that producers had cottoned on to how popular this wine was and were producing it all over Italy and calling it Prosecco, they realised that in order to maintain the integrity of the region and the quality of the really good stuff, they had to change the name of the grape to Glera. And Prosecco made from Glera can only be produced in two very specific DOC, so they're the Denominación de Origen Controlate. The first of these is DOC Prosecco, as I mentioned, that covers a wide area in the north of Italy between Veneto and Friuli. And then it's always worth looking at your bottle because slightly higher quality Prosecco comes from a higher quality area, excuse the pronunciation in advance, which is Conegliano Valdobbiadene, which is DOCG. So it's the G at the end of that stands for guaranteed, or have a certain level of guaranteed quality coming from this area, as well as more layers of flavour, more texture, more complexity and finesse to the Prosecco as well. Usually medium acidity with sort of fresh aromas of fruit and more white fruits, I'd say melons and pear drops. Now we will head back up to Northern Europe, to Germany. I mentioned in the introduction that the Germans have the highest consumption per capita of sparkling wine, and I'm talking about their national sparkling wine, which is called sect. Now, sect wine, typically the actual grapes, the wine came from either France or Italy and was made sparkling once it arrived to Germany, also using the tank method. The only way this wasn't the case is in something called Deutscher Sekt, and that's where the grapes must come from Germany. Typically Riesling grapes are used, and it tends to be a lot higher quality. It doesn't have to only be tank method now, so you can find some traditional method sparkling sects as well, which will no doubt be of a slightly higher category. One thing that's really appealing about sect is its low level of alcohol, so you can find sects that are about 6% alcohol. They're very light, they're flowery, think lemons, think white flowers, think green apple. They have a lovely natural acidity to them as well, and they're becoming really, really popular across the rest of Europe. Now, another nation that is huge drinkers, or that are huge drinkers of sparkling wine, is of course the United Kingdom, and England in particular, certainly in recent years, has begun to produce some incredible quality sparkling wines. The vineyards tend to be located in the south of England, where there's loads of limestone and chalk and acidity in the soil. The temperature, because of global warming actually, because it's all raised slightly, has gone from too wet and too cold to actually being an ideal temperature to grow grapes in to make sparkling wine. And interestingly, these wines are being entered into international competitions where they're tasted blind against French champagnes, for example, and they're actually winning, which is amazing. They are of an incredible high quality, I believe. I love them, but they also come with a price tag, but certainly worth trying. And as I said, aim for the south of England. 2016 as well was meant to be an incredible year for English sparkling wine. Now, although there are sparkling wines produced all over the world, there are several things that need to be taken into consideration when you are producing one, and that is things like having the right acidity in the soil, having the right temperature. It's the Australians who produce a sparkling Shiraz, which when I first heard about it sounded interesting but not particularly appetizing until I tried one, and as the name sounds, they are big, they are alcoholic, they are earthy, very, very smooth mousse Worth getting your hands on one if you can try. Excellent with things like barbecues, easy drinking, but it is a sparkling red wine. But we're going to finish with South Africa, which due to politics, unfortunately, and governmental decisions is often overlooked in terms of wine because of the inability to get the wine from the country to Europe, for example. But South Africa always had a huge domestic market for slightly sweet sparkling wines. And it was only in the 1970s when they began to make traditional method sparkling wines. They're still not hugely well known outside of South Africa, but becoming more and more well known, and they're really, really good quality. They come from the Western Cape. Anyone who knows South African wines will know that all of that area, because of the breeze and the soils and the climate in general, it is a winemaker's haven, and it's no different in terms of the sparkling wines they are making now as well. So I hope this has been useful for you. I also hope that you can see sparkling wine not just as an extension of a celebration, but also that it can be used in a more everyday occasion as well. Certainly my favourite. I'm very aligned with Madame Bollinger, who would drink it all day, every day. But there are so many different styles, there are so many different types, and I would just encourage you to try as many as possible to start developing your palate and what it is you like in terms of the grape and the production methods, and go from there. So until the next time, cheers!